The courtroom fell silent the moment I stood up, and I watched my son's lawyer, the man who'd spent 3 days tearing apart my character, freeze mid-shuffle of his papers. His name was Marcus Brennan, and he'd built his entire case on the premise that I was a delusional old woman clinging to fantasies about family honor. What he didn't know, what nobody in that room knew except me, was that I'd spent 37 years as a forensic accountant for the district attorney's office in 3 counties. I'd testified in over 200 cases. I'd dismantled money laundering schemes that made his client's embezzlement look like pocket change. My son Daniel sat at the defendant's table, refusing to meet my eyes, while his lawyer prepared to call me to the stand as a character witness. His biggest mistake. Subscribe and comment your state. You'll want to see where this goes. The bailiff called my name, and I walked forward carrying my leather folio, the one object nobody had questioned. The witness stand felt familiar under my hands as I placed the folio beside me, watching Marcus Brennan approach with that practiced smile attorneys use when they think they've already won. He'd interviewed me twice during discovery, taking my statements about Daniel's childhood, his education, his supposed good character. Never once had he asked about my career. My retirement had been quiet, just a small notice in the county newsletter 7 years ago, and I'd deliberately kept my past credentials off social media. Daniel knew, of course, but he'd never told his lawyer. Probably assumed I'd never contradict him in court, that maternal loyalty would keep me silent. He'd stolen $1.2 million from his employer's pension fund, and his defense strategy relied entirely on character testimony, painting him as incapable of such sophisticated fraud. That's where I came in, the devoted mother who'd raised him alone after his father died. Marcus began with easy questions designed to relax me, to make me comfortable before he guided me through the script he'd prepared. Mrs. Harrison, you raised Daniel as a single parent, correct? His voice carried that sympathetic tone meant to soften the jury. I confirmed it, watching him nod encouragingly. And he was always honest with you? Always responsible? I paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough to see his confidence waver. The leather folio sat beside me, its contents representing 37 years of documentation, habit, and evidence. He was a child I loved very much, I said carefully. Marcus smiled, missing the distinction between love and trust. He asked about Daniel's college years, his first job, his promotions. Each answer I gave was technically true, but notably absent of the character endorsements he expected. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Jennifer Chen, watched me with growing interest. Mrs. Harrison, in your opinion, is your son capable of the sophisticated financial crimes he's accused of? Marcus asked, finally reaching his key question. The courtroom leaned forward imperceptibly. I adjusted my reading glasses, then opened the folio deliberately, slowly. Marcus's smile faltered. Based on my professional experience, I began, watching his face change as those 3 words registered. I'd say he learned from observing someone very capable. Marcus interrupted, his voice rising slightly. Your professional experience? You were a homemaker, according to our interviews. I met his eyes steadily. I was a senior forensic accountant for the district attorney's office. I retired as the chief financial investigator for the state's fraud division. I've examined cases identical to this one. In fact, I reviewed the evidence packet in Daniel's case last month at the prosecutor's request. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Marcus actually stumbled backward a step. His face drained of color as the implications crashed over him. He'd built his entire defense around my testimony, supporting Daniel's supposed incompetence with complex financial systems. Instead, he just established that I was an expert qualified to authenticate the very crimes Daniel was accused of committing. Your Honor, Marcus said, his voice barely steady, I need to request a recess. But the judge, a veteran named Martin Sheffield, was already leaning forward with interest. I think we'll hear Mrs. Harrison's complete testimony first, Counselor. You called her as your witness. Marcus sank into his chair, and I heard him whisper, You can't be serious. Though whether he was talking to me, himself, or the universe, I couldn't tell. Jennifer Chen was already standing, ready to cross-examine. Daniel finally looked at me, and I saw the moment he realized his mother had never actually promised to lie for him. The prosecutor approached with barely concealed satisfaction. Mrs. Harrison, you mentioned reviewing the evidence in this case. What were your findings? I pulled out the first document from my folio, a 40-page analysis I'd completed using the same methodology I'd employed in 200 previous cases. The transactions follow a classic pattern of systematic embezzlement with attempted misdirection. The perpetrator created ghost accounts, routed funds through shell corporations, and falsified quarterly reports to mask the shortfall. The technical sophistication is moderate, competent, but not brilliant. Someone with accounting training could execute it. Someone with access to my old case files would find it even easier. I didn't look at Daniel as I said this, but I felt him flinch. The truth was, he'd asked to borrow my files 3 years ago, said he was curious about my career. I'd been flattered, had even walked him through some of my famous cases. Jennifer continued methodically, having me authenticate transaction records, explain forensic accounting principles to the jury, and detail exactly how the evidence trail led conclusively to Daniel. Every question Marcus should have asked during discovery, every credential he should have verified, now became another nail in his defense strategy's coffin. The jurors took notes furiously. One older woman in the back row kept shaking her head, and I knew she was thinking what they all were. What kind of mother testifies against her own son? The answer was complicated, layered with 37 years of watching financial crimes destroy innocent people's retirements. Daniel had stolen from a pension fund. 63 families would suffer because of him. My love for my son couldn't erase my responsibility to them. The folio contained not just my analysis, but also copies of the emails he'd sent me, asking supposedly hypothetical questions about investigation techniques. "Did your son ever discuss these transaction methods with you?" Jennifer asked. This was the question that would hurt most. I pulled out printed emails, dated and authenticated, showing Daniel's theoretical questions about ghost accounts and audit evasion. He asked me to review a fictional scenario for a novel he claimed to be writing. The scenario matched his actual crime pattern with 87% accuracy. The courtroom went completely silent. Marcus had his head in his hands. Daniel was staring at the table, and I could see his shoulders shaking. I'd loved that boy from his first breath. I'd worked 60-hour weeks to put him through college. I'd celebrated every promotion, every success. But I'd also spent 37 years watching criminals justify their actions while their victims suffered. When the prosecutor contacted me 6 weeks ago, I'd spent one sleepless night making my decision. Then I'd started my analysis. The judge called a recess after 2 hours of my testimony. In the hallway, Marcus Brennan approached me, his earlier confidence completely gone. "You realize you've destroyed your son's defense," he said. Not quite accusatory, but close. I met his eyes without flinching. "I realize my son destroyed 63 families' retirement security. That's $38 million in aggregate losses if you calculate the pension fund shortfall across all affected parties. Those are real people, Mr. Brennan. Real families." He opened his mouth, closed it, then walked away. My daughter-in-law Rebecca found me in the witness room, tears streaming down her face. "How could you?" she demanded. I understood her rage, her feeling of betrayal, but I also knew she had no idea her husband had been planning to run if acquitted. I'd found the offshore account applications in his desk when I'd visited last month. Court resumed, and Jennifer Chen spent another hour walking me through forensic exhibits. I explained how Daniel had accessed the pension fund's accounting system, how he'd created false vendor invoices, how he'd timed withdrawals to avoid triggering automatic fraud alerts. Every technique was one I'd seen before, had testified about before. The difference was that previously I'd been dismantling strangers' defenses. Now I was dismantling my son's. The jury watched me with a mixture of respect and horror. One young man kept glancing between me and Daniel, clearly trying to reconcile maternal love with prosecutorial precision. I couldn't help him with that reconciliation. I was still working on it myself. The folio grew lighter as I submitted document after document into evidence, each one another piece of the inescapable truth. Marcus attempted a few objections, but Judge Sheffield overruled them all. Finally, Jennifer asked her last question. "Mrs. Harrison, based on your expert analysis, did Daniel Harrison commit the crimes he's charged with?" The courtroom held its breath. I looked at my son for the first time since I'd started testifying. He was 34 years old, brilliant, charming, and absolutely guilty. Yes, I said clearly. The evidence is conclusive. My son systematically embezzled funds from the Riverside Municipal Pension Fund between March 2021 and January 2024. The documentation trail is comprehensive and irrefutable. Daniel's head dropped. Rebecca was openly crying. Marcus looked like he wanted to object, but couldn't find grounds. Jennifer nodded, satisfied, and returned to her seat. Then Marcus stood for cross-examination, and I saw him make the calculation every desperate attorney makes. He had to try to discredit me, even knowing it was futile, even knowing I'd spent 37 years defeating better lawyers than him. "Mrs. Harrison," Marcus began, his voice carefully controlled, "isn't it true you've been estranged from your son for the past year?" It was a weak angle, but his only one. I'd anticipated it. We had disagreements about his lifestyle choices and spending patterns. In retrospect, my concerns were warranted. He tried another approach. "You admit you're testifying for the prosecution. Isn't it possible you're biased against the defendant?" I almost smiled. "Mr. Brennan, I'm testifying to forensic evidence. The numbers don't care about my relationship with Daniel. The transaction records exist independently of my feelings." He pressed on, asking about my retirement, suggesting my methods were outdated, questioning whether I'd maintained my credentials. Each question gave me an opportunity to recite my qualifications, my recent consulting work, my published papers in forensic accounting journals. He was inadvertently strengthening my credibility with every challenge. After 30 minutes, Marcus gave up. "No further questions," he said quietly, returning to his seat. I was excused from the stand, but as I gathered my folio, Judge Sheffield spoke. "Mrs. Harrison, the court appreciates your expertise and your candor. Bailiff, please ensure Mrs. Harrison's safety, given the emotional nature of this case." It was a diplomatic way of acknowledging that I might need protection from my own family. I nodded my thanks and walked toward the exit. As I passed the defendant's table, Daniel finally spoke. "Mom," he said, just that one word, breaking on the syllable. I paused. Everything I wanted to say, about love, about disappointment, about the choice between one person and 63 families, crystallized in that moment. "I'm still your mother," I told him softly. "That's why this hurts so much." Then I walked out, carrying the folio that had held the truth. The trial concluded 3 days later. I didn't attend the remaining proceedings, but Jennifer Chen called me when the jury returned. Guilty on all counts. Daniel would serve 8 to 12 years in federal prison with mandatory restitution. The pension fund would recover most of the stolen money from Daniel's seized assets and a settlement with the bank that had failed to flag the suspicious transactions. Those 63 families would get their retirement security back. Jennifer told me the jury had deliberated for only 4 hours. My testimony had been decisive. "You did the right thing," she said, but I heard the unspoken question in her voice, the same one I asked myself every night. Does doing the right thing make it hurt less? The answer, I'd discovered, was no. The leather folio sat on my kitchen table, still containing copies of every document, every email, every piece of evidence I'd used to convict my own son. Rebecca filed for divorce within a month. She sent me a letter, handwritten, expressing her anger, but also her grudging understanding. "The Daniel I married wouldn't have stolen that money," she wrote. "Maybe I never knew him at all. Maybe you knew him better than anyone." She was wrong about that. I'd known the boy Daniel had been, the teenager he'd grown into, but I'd missed the moment when ambition and entitlement had rotted his ethics. Or perhaps I'd seen it and chosen to ignore it, hoping he'd correct course on his own. That was the guilt I carried, not that I'd testified, but that I might have prevented it all if I'd confronted him years earlier when I'd first noticed his flexible relationship with financial truth. The folio became a symbol of that failure, a leather-bound reminder that love doesn't excuse willful blindness. My sister Margaret was the first family member to visit me after the trial. She arrived unannounced on a Saturday morning, carrying coffee and bagels like we were just having a regular catch-up. We sat in my kitchen for an hour before she finally addressed it. "Half the family thinks you're a monster," she said bluntly. "The other half thinks you're a saint. Personally, I think you're just tired." She was right. I was exhausted from 37 years of carrying other people's secrets and lies, of being the one who had to tell the truth when everyone else wanted to look away. Margaret had been a social worker for 20 years, so she understood the weight of witnessing. "Mom would have been proud," she added softly. Our mother had been a teacher who'd once reported a colleague for stealing from student fundraisers. The fallout had cost her friendships and nearly her job. The pension fund families sent letters, 63 in total, one from each household Daniel had victimized. Some were grateful, thanking me for my courage. Others were cautiously sympathetic, acknowledging the impossible position I'd been in. A few were angry that I'd raised a thief, as if maternal influence could fully prevent adult choices. I read every letter, responded to each one personally. One couple, the Hendersons, invited me to coffee. Bill Henderson was 68, had worked as a city maintenance supervisor for 41 years, and had been planning to retire in June when he discovered his pension was short by $93,000. "We'd have lost our house," his wife Patricia told me, gripping my hand across the coffee shop table. "We'd have lost everything. Your testimony saved us." Their gratitude hurt worse than family condemnation, because it confirmed I'd made the right choice for the wrong person. Summer turned to fall, and I began consulting again, taking on pro bono cases for small municipalities trying to prevent fraud. The work was familiar, comforting even, but I approached it differently now. I'd always been methodical, precise, but now I looked for the human stories behind the numbers, the families who'd be hurt if crimes went unprosecuted. The folio stayed on my desk as I worked, a talisman of sorts. I'd replaced its contents with new case files, but I couldn't quite put it away entirely. My granddaughter Emma visited one afternoon. Rebecca had relented enough to allow supervised visits. Emma was 9, old enough to know her father was in prison, but not old enough to understand why her grandmother had put him there. "Daddy says you were mean to him," she said with heartbreaking directness. I took a breath, choosing my words carefully. "Your daddy made choices that hurt a lot of people," I told Emma, sitting beside her on the porch swing. I had to tell the truth about those choices. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, because I love him very much. But sometimes, loving someone means not protecting them from consequences. She processed this with the serious concentration children bring to complicated adult concepts. "Like when I broke Mom's vase and you said I had to tell her, even though I was scared?" I nodded, grateful for the parallel. "Exactly like that, except much bigger." Emma leaned against me, and I felt some tension in my chest ease. Whatever happened with the rest of my family, I could perhaps help her understand that truth and love weren't opposites. The folio visible through the screen door seemed less accusatory in that moment, more like what it actually was, evidence that difficult choices were still choices. Marcus Brennan called me 6 months after the trial, his voice hesitant on the phone. "Mrs. Harrison, I'm representing a new client in a fraud case. The prosecutor's expert seems to have missed several discrepancies in the evidence. Would you be willing to review the file?" I was surprised but agreed to look at it. The case involved alleged embezzlement at a non-profit, and he was right. The prosecution's forensic accountant had made serious errors that could send an innocent woman to prison. I spent 3 weeks analyzing the data, then testified for the defense this time, explaining how the actual thief had framed his supervisor. The woman was acquitted. Afterward, Marcus and I sat on the courthouse steps. "Thank you for giving me a chance after I called you a delusional homemaker," he said wryly. I appreciated his willingness to acknowledge his mistake. "Thank you for recognizing expertise when it contradicts your assumptions." Daniel was transferred to a federal facility in Pennsylvania, 300 miles away. I wrote to him weekly, but didn't visit for the first year. He needed time to process his anger, and I needed time to process my grief. His letters were initially bitter, full of accusations and self-pity. Gradually, they began to change. He started taking responsibility, attending counseling, working in the prison's financial literacy program, teaching other inmates to manage money legally. 18 months after his incarceration, he called and asked me to visit. I made the drive on a cold February morning, the folio on the passenger seat containing his letters, documentation of his slow transformation. The prison visiting room was exactly as depressing as expected. Gray walls, plastic chairs, vending machines humming in the corner. Daniel looked thinner, older, but his eyes were clearer than I'd seen them in years. "I'm sorry," he said immediately, the words spilling out before we'd even sat down. "Not sorry I got caught. Sorry for what I did. Sorry for who I became. Sorry for making you choose between me and those families." His voice cracked. I reached across the table, taking his hands. "I never stopped loving you, not for 1 second, but I couldn't lie for you either." We talked for 2 hours, covering years of disappointments and misunderstandings. He told me about the pressure he'd felt, the lifestyle he'd wanted to maintain, how easy it had been to justify each incremental theft. I told him about the letters from the pension fund families, how his actions had rippled outward, affecting marriages, health, futures. "The Hendersons invited me to their grandson's high school graduation," I said, "because they could afford to attend, because their pension was restored." The visit ended with something neither of us had expected: hope. Not for a changed verdict or an early release, but for eventual reconciliation and genuine redemption. "Mom," Daniel said as I prepared to leave, "that analysis you did, the one you presented in court, could you teach me how to do that kind of work? Legitimately, I mean. When I get out." I looked at my son, seeing past his mistakes to the possibility of who he might become. "Yes," I said, "but you have to finish paying your debt first, all of it, including the restitution." He nodded, understanding this was his path forward. I left the prison with the folio containing his letters, each one a small document of change. The drive home felt lighter somehow, as if the weight I'd carried since the trial had shifted from crushing burden to manageable load. Margaret helped me organize a family dinner 3 months later. Not everyone came. Rebecca declined, and Daniel's cousin Ryan sent a terse response calling me a traitor. But my sister, my nephew Mark, and 3 cousins gathered in my dining room for the first time since the trial. The conversation was awkward initially, everyone carefully avoiding the obvious topic. Finally, my nephew broke the silence. "Aunt Susan, I've been wanting to say something. I work in HR, and last year we caught an employee embezzling. Because of what you did, I found the courage to report him instead of letting it slide. He was a friend. It destroyed our friendship, but he was stealing from co-workers' retirement accounts." He paused, his voice thick. "You showed me that protecting people is more important than protecting relationships. That's hard, but it's right." The others nodded, and gradually, the evening became something approaching normal. Jennifer Chen invited me to speak at a forensic accounting conference in Chicago. The topic was ethical dilemmas in financial investigations, specifically cases involving family members or close associates. I almost declined, uncertain whether I could discuss Daniel's case publicly without falling apart. But Margaret convinced me to go. "Your story matters," she insisted. "Not just the what, but the how. How you made the decision. How you live with it." The conference room held about 200 accountants, auditors, and investigators. I stood at the podium, the leather folio beside me like always, and told them everything. About discovering my son's crime. About the sleepless night weighing 63 families against one. About walking into that courtroom, knowing I'd either lie or lose my son's trust forever. The room was completely silent when I finished. Then someone started clapping, and others joined. Afterward, dozens of people approached me with their own stories. A bank examiner who'd reported her brother-in-law, an IRS agent who'd investigated his uncle, a fraud analyst who'd discovered her best friend's embezzlement scheme. Each of them had made the same impossible choice, had carried the same guilt and conviction. We exchanged cards, emails, creating an informal network of people who understood that ethical obligations sometimes meant personal cost. One woman, a forensic psychologist named Dr. Amanda Wright, pulled me aside. "I'm writing a paper on moral injury in compliance professionals," she said. "Would you consider being interviewed? Your perspective on balancing family loyalty and professional duty is exactly what this field needs to examine." I agreed, grateful that the pain might serve a purpose beyond my individual situation. The folio's contents would become research data, case study material, teaching tools. Emma's 10th birthday arrived, and Rebecca allowed me to attend the party. It was the first time I'd seen Daniel's wife in over a year, and the encounter was tense but civil. Emma opened presents with the uninhibited joy of childhood, temporarily erasing the adult complications surrounding her. As I watched her, I thought about what kind of world I wanted her to inherit. One where people looked away from inconvenient truths, or one where difficult ethical stands were possible, even when they hurt. Later, when the other guests had left, Emma showed me her new journal. "My teacher says writing helps when things are confusing," she explained. "I've been writing about why you testified against Daddy. I think I'm starting to understand." She showed me a page covered in her careful print. Sometimes love means telling the truth, even when the truth is hard. Daniel's parole hearing was scheduled for January 2028, after he'd served 4 years. I wrote a letter to the parole board, neither advocating for nor opposing his release, simply documenting his participation in rehabilitation programs and his consistent restitution payments. He'd been working in the prison's accounting office, earning 42 cents an hour, every penny going toward his debt to the pension fund families. At his current rate, he'd pay off his portion of the restitution in approximately 37 years, the same number of years I'd worked in forensic accounting. The symmetry wasn't lost on me. Jennifer Chen called to inform me the board had approved his parole with conditions: continued restitution, 5 years supervised release, community service in financial literacy programs, and mandatory counseling. "He's one of the few embezzlers who've genuinely shown remorse," she told me. "Your testimony didn't just convict him, it forced him to confront what he'd done." Daniel was released on a Wednesday morning in late January. I picked him up from the facility, the drive back to Pennsylvania, as quiet as it had been 4 years earlier. He looked older now, lines around his eyes, gray threading his hair. But there was something different too, a humility that hadn't existed before prison. He'd be living in a halfway house initially, working as a bookkeeper at a nonprofit that helped formerly incarcerated people find employment. "The irony isn't lost on me," he said as we drove. "Using accounting skills to help people instead of steal from them." I glanced at him, seeing glimpses of the boy I'd raised beneath the man he'd become. "It's not irony," I told him. "It's redemption, if you choose it every day." The folio was in the back seat, containing his prison letters, his program certificates, documentation of 4 years of slow transformation. We stopped for coffee at a rest area halfway home. Sitting across from him in a booth, I felt the weight of the past 4 years settle between us. "Can I ask you something?" Daniel said suddenly. "Do you regret it? Testifying?" I considered the question carefully, wanting to give him honest truth instead of easy comfort. "I regret that you put me in that position. I regret that 63 families suffered because of your choices. I regret that Emma has spent years with her father in prison. But do I regret telling the truth? No, because the alternative would have meant living with a different kind of pain. The knowledge that I'd protected you while those families lost everything. I couldn't do that." He nodded slowly, accepting the answer. "I understand now. I didn't then, but I do now. You saved me from becoming someone irredeemable." Rebuilding trust was slower than building it had been originally. Daniel attended his mandated counseling, worked his bookkeeping job, paid his restitution consistently. We met for lunch once a month, gradually increasing to weekly dinners. Emma joined us sometimes, and I watched father and daughter navigate their changed relationship with cautious honesty. Rebecca remained cordial, but distant, her wound too fresh for full reconciliation. I understood. Some betrayals take more than 4 years to heal. Meanwhile, my consulting work expanded. I became known as the forensic accountant who'd testified against her own son, which gave me a peculiar kind of credibility. Defense attorneys called me when they genuinely believed their clients were innocent. Prosecutors called me when cases were complex. I'd become the person who couldn't be bought, intimidated, or swayed, the person who would tell the truth regardless of personal cost. The folio accompanied me to every case. The Hendersons invited me to Thanksgiving dinner in November 2028. It was surreal, sitting at their table, knowing I'd saved their retirement by destroying my son's freedom. Bill Henderson raised his glass in a toast. To Susan, who chose justice when it cost her everything. His words made me uncomfortable, implying a heroism I didn't feel. "I chose what I had to choose," I said quietly. There was no heroism in it, just necessity. But Patricia Henderson shook her head. "That's exactly what makes it heroic. You didn't want to do it. You did it anyway." Their grandson asked what they were talking about, and Bill explained simply, "Mrs. Harrison told the truth when it was hard. That's something to admire." Driving home that night, I thought about heroism and necessity, wondering if perhaps they were the same thing viewed from different angles. "Doctor," Amanda Wright's paper was published in the Journal of Forensic Psychology in early 2029, featuring my case study prominently. She'd interviewed me extensively, exploring the moral injury concept, the psychological trauma of violating one's own moral code even when making the ethically correct choice. Subjects like Mrs. Harrison experience ongoing distress not from making the wrong choice, but from being forced to choose at all, she wrote. The injury comes from the impossible situation, not the resolution. Reading her analysis helped me understand my own lingering pain. I hadn't been wrong to testify, but I'd been wounded by the necessity of it. The folio, always present, had become my way of carrying that wound visibly, a leather-bound reminder that some ethical stands leave scars. The paper sparked discussions in compliance departments, ethics committees, and professional organizations about supporting employees who faced similar dilemmas. Daniel completed his parole in 2033, 5 years of maintaining steady employment, consistent restitution, and clean drug tests. His parole officer, a stern woman named Carol Henderson, no relation to Bill and Patricia, called him a model case. Most embezzlers I supervise show remorse only until they're released, she told me. Your son actually changed. The day his parole ended, Daniel enrolled in an online master's program in forensic accounting. I want to do what you did, he told me. Not testify against family. God, I hope no one ever faces that. But investigate financial crimes, help recover stolen assets, protect people who can't protect themselves. I helped him with his applications, providing professional references carefully worded to acknowledge his conviction while endorsing his transformation. Several professors initially rejected him. One, Dr. Michael Torres from Northwestern University, accepted him specifically because of his criminal record. Reformed criminals make excellent fraud investigators, Torres explained. Emma graduated from high school in May 2034, a bright, thoughtful young woman planning to study social work. At her graduation party, she pulled me aside. Grandma, I'm writing my college entrance essay about you and Dad, about hard choices and redemption. Is that okay? I was surprised and touched. What will you say? She smiled. That my grandmother taught me truth matters more than comfort, and my father taught me it's never too late to become who you should have been. That between the two of you, I learned both courage and grace. I hugged her tightly. This granddaughter who'd witnessed the worst of our family's crisis and somehow extracted wisdom from it. Later, Rebecca approached me, our first substantive conversation in nearly a decade. Thank you for not giving up on him, she said simply, and for not lying for him. Both things mattered. The pension fund families held a reunion in 2035, 12 years after the verdict. All 63 households gathered in Riverside's community center for a celebration of their recovered security. Bill and Patricia Henderson had organized it, inviting me as guest of honor. I almost declined, still uncomfortable with gratitude for doing what conscience had demanded. But Margaret convinced me to attend. Let them thank you, she insisted. Let yourself accept that you made a difference. The event was overwhelming. Families introducing me to grandchildren who'd attended college because their tuition was secure, couples who'd taken long-delayed vacations, retirees who'd started small businesses with their restored pensions. One woman, Maria Gonzalez, told me her husband had died peacefully, knowing their daughter would inherit something instead of debt. Your testimony gave him peace in his final months, she said, crying. I cried too, finally allowing myself to feel the full weight of what that courtroom choice had meant. Daniel attended the reunion, bringing Emma. It had been his idea, wanting to face the people he'd harmed. The room went silent when he entered, 63 families staring at the man who'd stolen from them. Bill Henderson moved first, walking over to shake Daniel's hand. Thank you for coming, he said simply. And thank you for paying your debt. Other families followed, some friendly, others warily civil, a few coldly distant. Daniel apologized to each person, individual acknowledgments of specific harm. I watched my son accept their anger and their grudging forgiveness with equal humility. When he reached Maria Gonzalez, she looked at him for a long moment. My Roberto forgave you before he died, said everyone deserves a chance to be better. I'm still working on it. Daniel nodded, not arguing or defending. Take all the time you need, he said. I'll spend the rest of my life earning forgiveness I may never fully receive. That night, Daniel, Emma, and I sat in my living room, the leather folio on the coffee table between us. "Can I see it?" Daniel asked quietly. I handed it to him, and he opened it carefully, finding his prison letters, copies of his restitution receipts, photographs from the reunion. "You kept all of this." It wasn't quite a question. "I kept everything," I confirmed. "The evidence that convicted you, the documents that showed your change, all of it together, because that's the complete truth, not just your crime or your redemption, but both." Emma picked up one of his early letters, angry and bitter, then one from his final year, thoughtful and accountable. "Dad, you became a different person." He smiled sadly. "I became who I should have been originally. Your grandmother gave me no choice but to face that." I shook my head. "I gave you no choice but to face consequences. Becoming better was your choice entirely." Daniel completed his master's program in 2036 and passed the Certified Fraud Examiner exam on his first attempt. Finding employment was difficult with a criminal record, but a small firm in Ohio specializing in nonprofit audits hired him specifically because of his background. "We need someone who understands how fraud happens from the inside," the managing partner told him. His first major case involved uncovering embezzlement at a homeless shelter, recovering $87,000 that would have otherwise vanished. The director called me to express amazement. "Your son not only found the missing funds, but reorganized our entire accounting system to prevent future theft. He turned our vulnerability into strength." I felt a fierce pride mixed with lingering sadness. This was who Daniel could have been all along if he'd chosen differently. But perhaps he needed to fall completely to rise authentically. The folio gained new documents: his master's diploma, his CFE certificate, commendation letters from grateful clients. My 75th birthday arrived in 2037, and my family gathered. All of them, finally. Rebecca came with her new husband, a kind man named Thomas who worked as a teacher. Margaret brought her grandchildren, Daniel, Emma, and even cousin Ryan, who'd called me a traitor years ago but had since apologized. We filled my house with noise and laughter, the weight of the past not forgotten, but integrated, accepted as part of our shared history. During dinner, Emma stood to give a toast. To Grandma Susan, who taught us that loving someone doesn't mean protecting them from their own consequences, who showed us that the hardest right thing is still right, and who proved that families can survive truth-telling. Everyone raised their glasses, and I felt something close to peace. The folio sat on my desk in the next room, no longer a burden, but a testament, not to my choice alone, but to what happened after. The long, slow work of redemption and restoration. Daniel opened his own forensic accounting firm in 2038, specializing in fraud prevention training for small businesses and nonprofits. He called it Second Chance Financial Consulting, the name acknowledging his past while focusing on futures, his clients and his own. His first major contract was with the Riverside Municipal Pension Fund, now rebuilt and secure, to conduct annual fraud risk assessments. The irony was profound, the full circle undeniable. Bill Henderson, retired but still involved with the fund's oversight committee, had recommended him. Who better to prevent embezzlement than someone who committed it, paid for it, and devoted his life to making amends? Bill had argued. The committee had debated extensively before agreeing. Daniel approached the work with meticulous care, creating safeguards that would have prevented his own crimes. I consulted with him on the project. Our relationship transformed into professional partnership, alongside personal reconciliation. Jennifer Chen retired from the district attorney's office in 2039, and the county held a ceremony honoring her 30-year career. She invited me to speak, asking me to address the importance of expert witnesses in complex financial prosecutions. Standing at the podium, I talked about the responsibility of expertise, the weight of testimony, the necessity of truth regardless of personal cost. Afterward, Jennifer and I sat in a coffee shop, two women who'd spent decades pursuing justice in very different ways. "Your testimony in the Harrison case changed how I approach family involvement in white-collar crimes," she told me. "I used to assume family members would lie or obstruct. You showed me some people value justice over comfort." I smiled at her characterization. I valued both. I just couldn't have one without sacrificing the other. That's the part nobody tells you about doing the right thing. It costs something real, something you'll miss forever. Marcus Brennan and I maintained an unlikely professional friendship, consulting on cases where defense and prosecution needed neutral expert analysis. He'd rebuilt his practice, focusing on wrongful conviction cases, perhaps influenced by our shared experience. In 2040, he called about a woman accused of embezzling from her employer. The evidence looked conclusive, but something bothered him. I reviewed the case files and discovered what he'd sensed. The company's CFO had framed his subordinate using techniques nearly identical to Daniel's crime pattern. We testified together, explaining how the actual embezzler had manipulated records to implicate an innocent person. The woman was acquitted, and afterward Marcus and I reflected on the strange journey from adversaries in Daniel's trial to allies in someone else's exoneration. "You taught me to look beyond surface evidence," he said, "to consider who benefits from a particular narrative." I appreciated his growth, recognizing my own evolution in his words. The leather folio began to wear after 17 years of constant use. The spine cracked, the corners frayed, the leather softened to buttery suppleness. I could have replaced it, but its physical deterioration felt appropriate somehow, a visible manifestation of time's passage and wounds' gradual healing. Inside, the documents had multiplied. Daniel's transformation chronology, letters from pension fund families, Emma's college essay, newspaper clippings about Second Chance Financial Consulting, photographs from the 2035 reunion, Dr. Wright's published paper, Marcus's thank you note after the wrongful conviction case. The folio had evolved from evidence container to family archive, holding not just one story but many: crime and consequence, injury and healing, justice and mercy coexisting in leather-bound tension. When Emma asked if she could photograph it for a social work class presentation on restorative justice, I agreed, watching her carefully document each artifact. Daniel paid his final restitution installment in March 2041, 18 years after his arrest. The total amount, including interest and penalties, came to $1,473,000. He'd made the last payment in person, traveling to Riverside to hand a certified check to the pension fund administrator. Bill Henderson attended the occasion, as did several other affected families who'd followed Daniel's journey. The administrator, a careful woman named Linda Morrison, accepted the check and then did something unexpected. She shook Daniel's hand. "Mr. Harrison, in 26 years managing this fund, I've never seen an embezzler fully repay their debt. You're the first. That matters." Daniel's voice was rough when he responded. "It doesn't erase what I did. It just means I've finished paying for it financially. The other debt, the trust I destroyed, the security I stole, that's unpayable." Linda nodded. "Perhaps. But you've tried. That counts for something." My 80th birthday in 2042 was quieter than my 75th, just immediate family and a few close friends. Margaret had slowed considerably, her social work career long behind her, but her insight remained sharp. We sat on my porch while the party continued inside, watching the sun set over the neighborhood I'd lived in for 43 years. "You know what I admire most about what you did?" she asked suddenly. "Not that you testified. That was hard, but in some ways, it was the easy part. The hard part was continuing to love Daniel through his anger, his prison years, his struggle to rebuild. You didn't testify and then wash your hands of him. You stayed." Her observation struck me deeply. She was right. The courtroom choice had been binary, clear despite being difficult. The years afterward had required sustained effort, deliberate forgiveness, patient hope. The folio documented that longer journey, the one that mattered more than any single testimony. Love, it turned out, was not about avoiding hard truths, but about remaining present through their consequences. Emma earned her master's degree in social work in 2043, specializing in family systems and restorative justice. Her thesis, Reconciliation After Ethical Breach, a case study of truth-telling and transformation, examined our family's journey through academic and therapeutic lenses. She interviewed all of us, me, Daniel, Rebecca, Margaret, several pension fund families, even Marcus Brennan and Jennifer Chen. The result was a comprehensive analysis of how families navigate moral injury, criminal justice, and long-term healing. When she defended her thesis, I attended, listening to her present our story with scholarly objectivity and deep compassion. Her committee praised the work's nuance, its refusal to simplify complex ethical terrain into easy narratives. Afterward, she gave me a bound copy. "Everything I know about doing hard things with grace, I learned from watching you," she wrote in the dedication. I cried reading it. The folio opened beside me, its contents suddenly feeling less like burden and more like legacy. Daniel's firm grew steadily, employing 6 forensic accountants by 2044. All of whom knew his history. He'd made it policy to disclose his conviction to every client before engagement, believing transparency was foundational to trust. Remarkably, few clients declined service because of his past. Most found his experience valuable. Who better to identify fraud vulnerabilities than someone who exploited them? One nonprofit director told me when I asked about hiring Daniel despite his record. His work prevented an estimated $4 million in potential theft across his client base between 2038 and 2044, a small fraction of what he'd stolen, but a meaningful contribution nonetheless. When a business magazine profiled him as part of a feature on Second Chance Employment, he called me before publication. "They're going to mention you," he warned. "Your testimony, the trial, all of it." I told him I had no objection. The story was true. It was ours. We'd both earned the right to tell it. The Riverside Municipal Pension Fund established a fraud prevention award in 2045, naming it the Susan Harrison Award for Ethical Excellence in Financial Oversight. Bill Henderson called to inform me, his voice warm with satisfaction. "We wanted to honor not just what you did, but why you did it, putting the welfare of many over the comfort of one. The award will go annually to a financial professional who demonstrates extraordinary ethical courage." I was deeply moved and somewhat embarrassed, uncomfortable with memorialization of what had felt like simple necessity. But Bill insisted the award served an important purpose. People need to see that ethical choices are possible, even when they're painful. Your story gives permission for others to do the right thing when it costs them personally. The first recipient was a bank auditor who'd reported her sister-in-law's mortgage fraud scheme. She told me afterward that knowing my story had given her courage to come forward. The folio gained another artifact, the award program, my name in bronze on a plaque, a legacy I'd never imagined. Rebecca and I finally achieved genuine reconciliation in 2046, 23 years after the trial that had fractured our relationship. She invited me to lunch, just the two of us, in a cafe neither of us had been to before, neutral territory for a difficult conversation. "I need to apologize," she began, surprising me. "For years I blamed you for destroying our family. I was angry that you didn't protect Daniel, didn't lie for him, didn't choose his freedom over those strangers' pensions. But I was wrong. You didn't destroy our family. Daniel did. And you saved those 63 families from destruction. I'm sorry it took me 2 decades to see that clearly." We both cried. 23 years of hurt and misunderstanding finally acknowledged. She told me about her journey, therapy and reflection, and the slow realization that my testimony had been an act of love, not betrayal. "You loved him enough to let him face consequences. I thought love meant protection. You knew it meant truth." My health declined gradually after my 85th birthday in 2047. Nothing dramatic, just the slow accumulation of years, arthritis, reduced mobility, occasional confusion. Daniel and Emma took turns staying with me, ensuring I wasn't alone. The folio remained on my desk, and I found myself reviewing its contents more frequently, touching each document like a talisman. Emma noticed my increasing attachment to it. "Grandma, what do you want done with all of this?" she asked gently one afternoon. "The letters, the trial documents, everything in that folio?" I'd thought about it considerably. "I want it donated to the Forensic Accounting Association's Ethics Archive," I told her. "Not as a trophy, but as a teaching tool. Let students see the real cost of ethical stands. Let them understand that doing the right thing doesn't always feel good, doesn't always bring peace, but it's still necessary." She promised to honor that wish, and I felt a weight lift, knowing the folio's contents would serve a purpose beyond my own processing of pain. Daniel's firm won a national award for fraud prevention innovation in 2048, recognizing his development of a training program that reduced embezzlement attempts in small businesses by 43%. The award ceremony in Washington, D.C. drew executives, government officials, and industry leaders. Daniel invited me as his guest, insisting I share credit for his career. "Everything I know about forensic accounting, I learned from you," he said in his acceptance speech. "First by watching you work, then by experiencing the thoroughness of your investigation, finally by studying your methodology to build something legitimate. My mother taught me that expertise can be used to harm or heal. I chose harm once. I've spent 19 years choosing healing instead. This award belongs to both of us, her for showing me the right path, me for finally taking it." The standing ovation was for him, but his eyes found mine in the audience, and we shared a moment of complete understanding. The journey from courtroom to ceremony had been long, painful, and ultimately redemptive. The pension fund families held their final reunion in 2049, 26 years after the verdict. Many of the original 63 members had passed, but their adult children attended, bringing grandchildren who'd benefited from restored financial security. Bill Henderson, now 93 and frail, opened the gathering by reflecting on the quarter-century of stability my testimony had preserved. "Susan Harrison gave us our futures back," he said simply. "Some of us struggled to forgive her son. All of us have benefited from her courage." The younger generation asked questions, wanting to understand how one woman's decision had rippled through decades of their family's histories. I answered honestly, explaining the calculation I'd made that sleepless night in 2023, 63 families versus one son, irreversible harm versus temporary separation, enabling crime versus enforcing consequence. A young woman, Maria Gonzalez's granddaughter, approached me afterward. "My grandmother died believing in forgiveness because you showed her justice and mercy could coexist," she said. "Thank you for that gift." Margaret passed away peacefully in her sleep in early 2050, surrounded by family. Her funeral was large, reflecting a life spent helping others through social work and community service. During the reception, her eldest son shared that Margaret had kept newspaper clippings about Daniel's trial, his imprisonment, his release, and his successful consulting firm. Mom told me she was proudest of Aunt Susan, not for testifying, but for continuing to love Daniel through everything that came after. She said that's what real integrity looked like, not just making hard choices, but living with them. His words captured Margaret's understanding perfectly. She'd been my anchor through the darkest years, never judging, always present, offering perspective when guilt threatened to overwhelm me. After the funeral, I added her obituary to the folio. This sister who'd understood that moral courage required sustained effort, not just dramatic moments. Without her steady support, I might have fractured under the weight of family condemnation and self-doubt. Emma opened a therapy practice in 2051, specializing in family reconciliation after ethical breaches and criminal justice involvement. Her client base grew quickly, families referred by courts, parole offices, and other therapists struggling with cases involving loved ones who'd committed crimes. She used our family's story carefully, never revealing identifying details, but drawing on lessons learned. "Your testimony gave me a framework for helping families navigate impossible situations," she told me during one visit. "The question isn't whether to tell the truth. That's foundational. The question is how to maintain love while enforcing boundaries, how to support someone through consequences without enabling their harmful behavior. You modeled that for years, even when it hurt. I was gratified that our painful journey could serve others facing similar dilemmas." The folio's eventual donation to the Ethics Archive would complement Emma's therapeutic work, offering both academic and emotional resources for people torn between loyalty and justice. My 90th birthday in 2052 was celebrated quietly, my energy limited, but my spirit content. Daniel, now 70, sat beside me, his own hair white, his face lined with years of hard-won wisdom. Emma brought her teenage daughter, my great-granddaughter Claire, who'd recently expressed interest in forensic accounting. "Tell me the story," Claire requested, settling at my feet with the directness of youth. I looked at Daniel, silently asking permission. He nodded. So I told her everything, the discovery, the choice, the testimony, the collapse of Marcus Brennan into his chair when he realized his entire defense strategy had crumbled. I told her about the years afterward, the slow rebuilding, the consistent restitution payments, the transformation of crime into curriculum. Claire listened intently, occasionally glancing at her grandfather, reconciling the story's villain with the gentle man she knew. When I finished, she said, "Great-grandma, did you ever regret it?" It was the question Daniel had asked decades earlier. My answer remained unchanged. I regretted the necessity, never the choice. The Forensic Accounting Association scheduled the donation ceremony for October 2053, acknowledging both my contribution to the field and the folio's educational value. I was 91, increasingly fragile, but determined to attend. Daniel accompanied me, carrying the leather folio that had witnessed 30 years of documentation. The association's president, Dr. Sarah Kim, accepted it formally, describing how its contents would be digitized, preserved, and made available to students studying professional ethics. Mrs. Harrison's folio represents something unique in our field, she explained to the assembled members. Complete documentation of an ethical dilemma from initial discovery through long-term resolution. Students will see not just the dramatic courtroom moment, but the decades of living with that choice. That's the real lesson. Ethical stands aren't made once, but sustained daily. The folio was placed in a climate-controlled archive, its battered leather and yellowed documents now protected, preserved, accessible. I felt simultaneously relieved and bereft, as if surrendering a piece of myself while ensuring its purpose would continue beyond my lifetime. Daniel and I sat in the hotel room after the ceremony, both exhausted but satisfied. "Thank you," he said suddenly, "for everything. For testifying, for visiting me in prison, for helping me rebuild, for keeping those records, for turning our worst chapter into something that might help others." I took his hand, feeling its weathered strength. "You turned yourself into something that might help others. I just documented it." He shook his head. "No, Mom. You gave me no choice but to change. That testimony destroyed every excuse I'd built, every rationalization I'd constructed. You forced me to see myself clearly, what I'd done, who I'd become, who I'd hurt. That clarity was a gift, even though it felt like devastation at the time." We sat in comfortable silence, two people who'd journeyed from courtroom devastation to archive donation, from fractured family to hard-won peace. The folio was gone, but its lessons remained, embedded in memory and practice, in Emma's therapy work and Daniel's consulting firm, in the award bearing my name, and the lives changed by brutal honesty. I developed pneumonia in December 2053, my 91-year-old immune system unable to fight effectively. The hospital was efficient and kind, but everyone understood recovery was unlikely. Daniel stayed by my bedside, reading me letters from pension fund families, stories of grandchildren's college graduations and comfortable retirements and financial security preserved. Emma brought photographs, the 2035 reunion, Daniel's firm opening, Claire's birth, Margaret's last birthday. Rebecca visited, bringing Thomas their marriage now 25 years strong. She held my hand and told me I'd been braver than she'd initially understood, wiser than she'd given me credit for. Marcus Brennan sent flowers with a note. "You taught me that expertise means nothing without integrity. Thank you." Jennifer Chen called, her voice warm with respect and affection. Bill Henderson's daughter visited on behalf of the pension fund families, bringing a plaque engraved with all 63 names. "You saved them," she said simply. "All of them." I drifted in and out of consciousness, surrounded by evidence that one difficult choice had rippled outward in ways I'd never fully comprehended. On my last morning, clarity returned briefly. Daniel sat beside me, and I found words for what I needed him to understand. "I never stopped loving you. Not in the courtroom, not in prison, not once in 30 years. Love doesn't mean protecting people from their own consequences. It means staying present through them, believing in their capacity to become better, holding space for their transformation. You transformed yourself. I just witnessed it." He was crying, but he smiled through tears. "I know, Mom. I've always known. Even when I was angry, even when I blamed you, I knew you loved me. That's why your testimony hurt so much, because it came from love, not hatred. You cared more about who I could become than who I was. That's the greatest gift you ever gave me." We sat together in the hospital's sterile quiet, mother and son, connected by bonds that courtroom testimony and prison sentences had strained but never broken. Love and truth, I'd discovered, weren't opposites but partners, both necessary for genuine family. I died peacefully on December 17th, 2053, with Daniel holding my left hand and Emma holding my right. The obituary Daniel wrote described my 37 years in forensic accounting, my testimony in over 200 cases, my role establishing fraud prevention protocols still used statewide. It mentioned my family, son, granddaughter, great-granddaughter, without detailing our specific history. The funeral drew an unusual crowd: former colleagues, grateful clients, pension fund families, wrongfully accused defendants I'd helped exonerate, students from the Forensic Accounting Association, and people who'd heard my story and been inspired to make their own difficult ethical stands. Marcus Brennan attended, standing in the back, his presence a testament to professional respect transcending personal history. Jennifer Chen delivered a eulogy describing my contribution to justice with precision and warmth. But it was Emma's words that captured the fullness of my life. My grandmother taught me that loving someone means telling them the truth, especially when the truth is hard. She showed me that ethical courage isn't about feeling brave, but about acting rightly despite fear. She demonstrated that families can survive truth-telling, that redemption is possible when consequences are faced honestly, and that the hardest choices often yield the greatest transformations. Daniel spoke last, his voice steady despite visible emotion. My mother sent me to prison. That's a fact. She also visited me there, wrote to me weekly, helped me rebuild my life afterward, and never stopped believing I could become someone worth becoming. Both things are true. Both things matter. I spent years angry at her testimony, feeling betrayed by the one person I thought would protect me, regardless of what I'd done. Prison gave me time to understand that real love, the kind that transforms and heals, doesn't protect people from consequences. It holds them accountable while holding space for their redemption. My mother did that for me. She also did it for 63 families I'd harmed, choosing the many over the one, choosing justice over comfort. That choice defined her integrity. Living with that choice's consequences defined her love. I am here today, a free man, a business owner, a father and grandfather, because my mother valued truth more than my approval, because she believed I could handle consequences and emerge better. She was right. His words received sustained applause, recognition that authentic reconciliation requires acknowledging painful truth alongside hard-won grace. The pension fund families funded a scholarship in my name, awarded annually to students pursuing careers in forensic accounting or financial ethics. The first recipient was a young woman whose grandfather's pension I'd helped preserve, creating a direct lineage from testimony to education to future protection. Daniel's firm established a pro bono program offering free fraud prevention training to nonprofits, calling it the Susan Harrison Initiative. Emma's therapy practice developed a specific curriculum for families navigating ethical breaches, using anonymized lessons from our journey. Claire, my great-granddaughter, enrolled in an accounting program, telling the admissions committee she wanted to follow her great-grandmother's path of using financial expertise to protect vulnerable people. The folio, now digitized and accessible in the Ethics Archive, was downloaded by students worldwide, its documents teaching thousands what one sleepless night's decision had cost and created. My life's final chapter, the one I'd dreaded and agonized over, had become foundation for others' ethical courage. Truth-telling, painful as it was, had proven generative, its fruits visible in protected families, transformed lives, and sustained integrity across decades. The final document added to the archive was Daniel's reflection, written 6 months after my death. He described the journey from defendant to convicted felon to redemptive practitioner, crediting my testimony not as betrayal, but as catalyst. My mother gave me the gift of inescapable truth, he wrote. She could have lied, could have protected me, could have enabled my continued moral decline. Instead, she told the truth and then stayed present through every consequence. She visited me in prison. She helped me rebuild afterward. She never let me forget what I'd done, but she also never stopped believing I could do better. That combination, accountability plus hope, saved my life and rebuilt my character. The courtroom testimony was one day. Her sustained love through 19 years of aftermath was the real transformation. Both were necessary. Both required courage. I spent years understanding the testimony's bravery. I spent decades appreciating the aftermath's grace. His words, preserved alongside trial transcripts and pension fund letters and transformation documentation, completed the folio's narrative, showing that ethical stands reach their full meaning not in dramatic moments but in patient, persistent years of living with hard choices while maintaining love. The leather-bound container that had witnessed 30 years of documentation now rested in climate-controlled preservation, its contents teaching future generations that integrity and affection, justice and mercy, accountability and grace, truth and love, these seeming opposites were actually partners, all necessary, all possible, all worth the cost they demanded. My story, our story, Daniel's and mine, mother and son, testimony and transformation, ended not with courtroom collapse, but with archive preservation, not with family fracture, but with multi-generational healing, not with regret, but with redemption. Hard won, slowly built, honestly earned, completely true.